Camille Stewart Gloster is a strategist, attorney, and executive whose cross-cutting perspective on complex technology, cyber and national security, and foreign policy issues has landed her in significant roles at leading government and private sector companies, including the White House, Department of Homeland Security, and Google. Camille builds global cybersecurity, privacy, emerging technology, AI, and election security integrity programs in complex environments for large companies and government agencies. And she is our guest today. This is Civic Cipher, and I'm your host, Ramses Ja.
And I am Q Ward.
All right. So Camille Stewart Gloster, that feels so formal since we've talked and we have a bit of a rapport now. But welcome to the show. It's so exciting to finally have you on. These are some conversations we've been looking forward to having, and you are just the person to have them with. So, first off, how's your day going so far? How you feeling?
First, thanks for having me. I'm feeling great. It's what day is it? Wednesday, and it's beautiful, and we're about to have our election. So I'm ready for that.
Yeah, I absolutely think that we're ready for that. First up, I talked a bit about your background, but I didn't go into any detail. Again, one of the things that we like to do here is make sure that our listeners know who we are talking to. So tell us a little bit about who you are. We start our stories at the beginning. So, maybe where you were born, how you grew up, what motivated you to get into the field that you're in, and sort of what led you to today's conversation.
Yeah. So my parents immigrated here from Jamaica. I grew up in Ohio. My dad is a computer scientist and my mom's a college professor and a nurse. And so I grew up knowing that I wanted to do something in the tech space, but I also wanted to be a lawyer. And so I used to make them sign contracts for every time they made me a promise. And how that manifested itself through my education career was realizing that what I liked about the law was complex challenges and the intersection of society and those complex challenges. And what better place to do that than technology? And so I found myself working on cybersecurity issues and really pulling together my technical acumen with my legal background to kind of live at the intersection of people, technology, society, policy.
So you don't have to really depend on hypotheticals, given your experience with election integrity in 2016 and in 2020. In your opinion, or in your experience rather, what are the most pressing cybersecurity threats facing this 2024 presidential election, and how should the candidates address them?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, there has been a lot of work done since 2016 to build resilience in our election infrastructure. So it is unlikely that a foreign adversary is going to be able to tamper with our elections such that it changes the results. And I want people to feel comfortable in that. There has been a huge investment in remediating any of the vulnerabilities in our election infrastructure. That said, China, Russia, Iran are all trying to confuse everybody. They would love to promote and sow confusion and discord and erode the trust in our elections by releasing, recently there was a video that said that there was, fake ballots and things like that. That is probably the biggest threat, right? Any attacks on election infrastructure are pretty distributed. Every state, every county, the elections are run at such a local level that those differences across localities mean that there is no one uniform attack that could stop our elections, that could keep us from counting the ballots, that could help us figure out who was elected. But that trying to sow confusion is the biggest threat. And there's been a lot of great work done at the state level and at the federal level to try to combat that.
So my question is, how do you know that it's China or that it's Russia or, Iran or whatever foreign entity? How do you know that it's like a foreign agent that's doing the interfering and not just people who are conspiracy theorists or whatever, A? And then the second part is, how can people themselves vet the information that they're consuming to know whether or not there's an attempt at influencing their opinion on the election. So how do you know where it's coming from? And then how do people themselves determine whether or not they're getting good information?
Yeah. There's, people always talk about the best way to lie is be as close to the truth or have as much truth in there as possible.
Okay.
So the best way to sow discord, to make people uncomfortable, is to leverage existing narratives. Maybe they aren't as far spread as they appear to be because of the manipulation that you're doing, or maybe they're start with the thread of something that's true, but exacerbate that. So, I mean, Russia, China, Iran, they're all trying to exacerbate existing tensions, racism, sexism, xenophobia, all of the things, the social unrest that underpins our society and makes people uncomfortable and feel things. But it's the scale, it's the impact, it's how they're being weaponized against a candidate or against the process, the determining of trust, the erosion of your confidence in how things are playing out, not just your discomfort with people's isms. And I mean, the way that we determine, or the way that the government determines it's Russia, China, Iran, is there are a number of tactics and things that are used commonly by these actors, and they will do a lot of work on the back end through their intelligence sources to determine that it is Russia, China, Iran. But they are pulling on threads of things that are happening. There are also threat actors or malicious actors that are domestic that might be exacerbating tensions and further polarizing narratives. It's not isolated to those actors, but those actors do benefit from sowing discord amongst the U.S. electorate to make people decide not to vote or to try to move the votes in a given direction. That requires of us to do some due diligence and to be thoughtful about the information that we are consuming. And there are a number of resources. Most of your secretaries of state or whoever's running your elections at a state level and at a local level have websites that put out the truth about how to vote, where to vote, when to vote, all of those things, which are a lot of the information that it tends to be manipulated. But also the Cybersecurity and Information Security Agency, that's part of the federal government, has a whole website about election misinformation. And you can go there and see if something's true or not. And it behooves us all to be thoughtful about that and to leverage those resources to make sure that some claim that you heard about election interference or random people who don't exist voting in some place, see if that's actually true and if that's really happening. And they'll post information about whether those claims are legitimate so that you can check your sources, that you can help debunk some of this misinformation and disinformation that's spreading.
That is really interesting because you said something about kind of hiding the lie amongst mostly truths. Mm-hmm. I think when some common folks, i.e. Ramses and myself, hear things like cybersecurity and things like that, we think Mission Impossible and espionage movies.
Yeah.
When it could be something as simple as a website with a different dot other than .gov
yes.
that mirrors what a person's normal I will vote type of website would look like and just has enough information to look and seem real. Yeah. How should campaigns and or candidates combat that in a way that their normal voter that isn't really tapped into, bad actors, how could they prioritize the right type of communication to steer those who are seeking the right information? Because Ramses and I know not everyone is actually seeking the right information. Some people tap into that polarity and amplify it, but there are people who are looking for accurate, vetted out information. So candidates and campaigns that are trying to reach those voters and make sure they have access to the right policy information, the right voting information amongst these bad actors that are not always Ethan Hunt level spies. Sometimes it's just something simple as putting, as you already, communicated, enough truth around the lie, enough, of what people would typically be looking for and hide a little bit of misinformation in there. So what are some things that campaigns and candidates can do to try to help their voters or just interested parties sift through that kind of nonsense sometimes?
Yeah, you've seen a lot of it. Multimodal communication, going to people where they are. Despite all the controversy around TikTok, you see the VP Harris is on TikTok. She is talking to people on the platforms and in the programs that they listen to. She's been on more podcasts about women's issues, or just to reach different communities to make sure that her narrative, the facts about her campaign, her policy proposals, where people can find out additional information about her and her candidacy can be found. And you'll see that at the state and local levels as well, as folks are going to where people are, whether that's town halls, whether that's having big speeches in communities that need to hear the policy platform and the truth about information. That still is incumbent upon people to make sure that they're watching her social media platform versus someone else's. But being available in the places where people are seeking their information is a really big tool. And then also protecting those sources of information, like making sure that you have the security on your social media accounts so that they're not easily hacked, so that someone is not usurping your voice and corrupting your narrative. That's a really important thing. And there have been a lot of investment by companies and campaigns to support that kind of resilience and security for campaigns and candidates. And so that coming together of the broader community is also really important.
So you mentioned TikTok, and that brings me the thought.
It always does.
Yeah. So I have, I've been inundated with election coverage. That's what we do here. And so I vaguely recall seeing a headline, and I don't even know how true it is, but TikTok is kind of on its last leg here in the States, and it's going away. And, there was a lot of concern about the capacity, I suppose, for TikTok's parent company to harvest data on citizens in the United States. Just for those who are like me and didn't get a chance to get beyond the headline, talk to us a bit about what's going on there, whether or not we were really at risk for the data harvesting or whatever the concerns were, and how I suppose how that impacts, I guess, government policy insofar as social media platforms are concerned moving forward.
Yeah. So China has set up a legal and regulatory landscape that allows them to get access to companies that operate within their country.
Mm-hmm.
And so ByteDance being a Chinese company, China has the capacity to say, I need access to all of this information.
Okay.
ByteDance claims that is not happening and that the Chinese government does not have access to the personal information of its users. Whether or not that is true, the capacity, the legal support for them to make such a request exists.
Mm-hmm.
So the US government has determined that is a national security threat. If you think about the best ways to perpetuate a cyber attack, it is by using attributes about you as a person or your behavior. So you might use your mother's maiden name as your security question for your bank account. I bet you talked about your mom on your social media and that you might have said her maiden name. Like, there are different ways that level of access could expose you. So whether it's a data point like that or something just about your clicking habits that could indicate how I could wage a social engineering attack against you that might get you to click on this negative thing that I want you to click on. And so that China could gain access to, the Chinese government could potentially gain access to a system that you have access to, or information about you that just benefits their long-term ends. And so that's the national security concern there, because just think how many people in your family are work at a government or large organization, that whether or not they have access to sensitive information, once you get access to the information networks in that company, in that organization, you can move around and gain access to things that you really shouldn't be able to see. And so that national security threat was determined to be too great to allow TikTok to operate under ownership of China. So they must divest of TikTok and have some US ownership, or else it'll get banned early next year. And so that's the road that we're on. Will ByteDance find some US ownership for TikTok to be able to create the separation that the US government determines that is necessary? Or will the ban move forward? And so the next president will have a real decision to make about whether or not to enforce that and how to, drive forward that initiative, and whether or not that does color what we do on social media in general. And it has to, but how? Once we do that to China, they will do the same to our companies, right? It sets a precedent that there is a level of access that will become untenable, unappreciated by different countries. And so we start ourselves in this push and pull with companies as they try to service clients and users around the world. And so we are on the cusp of a very interesting dynamic that is about to unfold across social media, particularly between the US and China, but really in general.
That is so interesting, because to the novice or naive user, something like TikTok could seem so benign with regard to national security, but then you realize just how much you share. Ramses and I talk about our mom, my mom, who's adopted him and loves him more, and ask where her baby is when I get home, but she's talking about him. But I don't want to sound too hurt on this on this call. We talk about her all the time. Yeah. And when you said that, I'm like, wow, that is such a clever and unique point of view that I wouldn't have ever considered. Now, you have worked extensively with regard to policy on national security. How should our government prioritize the protection of our broader digital infrastructure, and in what ways can we further, as you said, strengthen that infrastructure moving forward?
Yeah. So the office that I worked at the White House in the Biden administration is called the Office of the National Cyber Director. It is a new office in the White House with the aim to drive towards a vision of a digital ecosystem that is secure, resilient, defensible, and equitable. And that office has a real opportunity to kind of align all of the authorities across the federal government, make sure everybody has the priorities, resources, mandate to be able to execute against the priority set, but also kind of deconflict things. And that organization is a real opportunity for the federal government to lean into what we want the future to look like. And that's what the National Cybersecurity Strategy does. It outlines an affirmative vision for what we want the digital environment to look like. It should reflect all of us. It should align to our values. It should be safe. We should want to be able to put our kids on the internet and not be afraid of that. There should be the right protections in place. And so an investment in an office like that, I think, is a really important evolution in how our country has organized itself on issues of technology and security and privacy, that outlining where we want to be and then making the investments to get us there, making the policy choices to get us there is really, really important. And a big piece of that is, how do we invest in making sure the people understand technology in a way that allows them to reap the benefits of jobs in technology, but also to protect themselves and their family. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I led at the White House was writing this national cyber workforce strategy. And what it said essentially was like, the people are at the center of this. I mean, technology shows up in the lives of people, and your use of it determines its viability, how safe it is, how safe it's not, all of these things. And so there are some skills that everybody should have, not just digital literacy, which is like being able to turn it on and off, but computational literacy, which is understanding the choices you're making, and digital resilience, which is being able to adapt to changing technology. And that focus on making sure that everybody has the skills to be able to thrive in a digital environment, be able to work in a digital environment, be able to, protect and provide for their family is a hallmark of where our government is going, and an investment that must continue as we transition administrations.
Now, that brings me to the thought that there might be some populations, some facets of our country that are particularly vulnerable, or at least more vulnerable than other facets of the population. Yeah. And they might be vulnerable to specific type of things. Poor people comes to mind.
Yeah.
And historically marginalized people comes to mind. Talk to us about, I see you nodding in the affirmative. Talk to us a little bit about that. Who might be more susceptible to, cybersecurity risks, and what should those communities do? And really, what should the government be doing to ensure that there's a bit more resiliency built into the society insofar as these vulnerable populations are concerned?
Yeah. So one of the things that the government is doing is really investing in supporting at a state, local level, resilience of our education system, our healthcare systems, all of these critical infrastructure that support our everyday lives. Because to your point, yes, there are things that individuals can do, and I'll talk about those in a second. But shifting the burden from individuals to bigger organizations that have the resources and the wherewithal to be able to advance security and resilience is what we need to do. And so the government has taken on that onus, but also is charging big companies like your favorite providers, the Apples, the Googles, cloud providers, all of those companies, with making sure that security is a part of the design, that they are privacy forward, so that you don't have to do as much thinking about it, because you shouldn't have to be a cybersecurity expert to be able to navigate the technology you use every day. It should be incumbent upon them to do that work for you. Now, there are still things that you need to do, just like you're not a physical security expert. You still make choices every day about how to protect you and your family. Like, for example, you might walk down an alley because you know karate, and I'm not walking down it because I don't know karate, right?
Yeah.
You
All right. I'm with you.
But that choice was informed by your skills, your background, all of these things, and mine as well. But we came to different outcomes. That's what I want for people in the digital world as well. I want you to feel enough agency and autonomy that you're like, I need to put a deadbolt on my door, which is like, two-factor authentication, because I don't need nobody coming in the front door. That should not be so easy for you to do. I'm going to use a password manager because I don't want to have to think of a bunch of new passwords, but it's really important for me to have a secure password, or a more complex password, which is like having a lock on your front door. I want people to make those little tweaks. Those small things actually remediate 80% of the threats against you. And if you leave the last 20 to the professionals, we would be in a much better place. But everybody needs to do those small things, like updating their software, using two-factor authentication, having secure passwords. Those little things actually make you a lot safer, make the ecosystem a lot safer. And then the big, horrible threats, then national security and cybersecurity practitioners can go after.
Remind me later to tell you a story about me seeing some ninjas walking down the street at night. You brought up karate, so I gotta make sure I tell you that later.
He's going to include the hi-ya.
I want to switch gears a little bit. You would think something as straightforward as cybersecurity would be you would think the reciprocity and the bipartisan support for strengthening that infrastructure would be present. You would also think, with regards to careers in that space, that diversity in thought, diversity in approach, and diversity in the way that people think when they hear the word diversity and DEI would be important to everyone. That's not a issue that just affects me or you, but that's something that the entire country should be able to get behind. you have personally been a champion for diversity in your field through your work with Share the Mic and Cyber.
Mhm.
If you were having a conversation with, let's say, our current VP, Madam Vice President Harris, um, what are some ways that she could, or any candidate could address the need for more diversity in the cybersecurity workforce?
Oh, great question. Because I came to emphasize the need for diversity in the cyber workforce and the tech space in general, not because it's the right thing to do or a moral imperative or anything like that, but in doing the work, it is incumbent upon us to bring a plethora of experiences and perspectives to actually understand the threat and the opportunities. And that's how I would encourage her to explain it. So, for example, I use this one a lot, WhatsApp. When it was created, it was and it still is, an encrypted messaging app that people use to communicate back and forth. A lot of people use it while they travel, but in immigrant communities, it has become a lifeline to your family. When your mama is back in wherever, that's how you talk to her, your aunties, your cousins, whoever. And it had become a hub for modern day chain letters. And in the heart of 2020, when we were dealing with the pandemic and an election, a lot of pandemic related misinformation and election related information flowed through WhatsApp because people put a lot of stock in what their auntie said, what their
Mhm.
cousins said in a different way. So when your auntie told you to go boil that bushroot tea because it's going to cure COVID or prevent you from getting it, you decided to boil that bushroot, right? And you thought you didn't need to go get a vaccine or whatever, right?
Yeah, we dealt with
Which
that.
Yes, indeed.
exactly. It's a very different way that information moved through communities because of that immigration, that immigrant tie. And WhatsApp had to come to realize that people were putting stock in that information in a different way and made some changes in what you see. So now when you're on WhatsApp, if it's something that's forwarded, it shows you that it's been forwarded a number of times. It shows you that that information wasn't organically created by your auntie. That's not her homemade bushroot tea. And so those little tweaks in usability and the way information services itself, shows itself to you, created a lot more security for individuals and a lot more information security to individuals. But it required somebody who had an understanding or it's their lived experience to be a part of an immigrant community to say, yo, when my auntie sends X, that means something. Or I might download that image because my auntie sent it to me, my cousin sent it to me. And those displays of how technology shows up in the lives of people and how culture and background and all of the things about us intersect with the technology and then change the nature of its use, change the nature of how we think about it. That is why we need diversity in how we think about how to combat threats, because you're not going to identify that threat if it is not your lived experience, or you're less likely to, or it'll take longer if it's not your lived experience to have gone through that. And so the best proxy for understanding the multiple ways that technology shows up in the lives of people is diversity. And so getting more people on a team, finding other ways to bring other perspectives into how you think about building out ecosystems or remediating threats is the best way for us to be resilient and secure.
All right. So a bit earlier, you mentioned how information flowed on WhatsApp and how, you know, your aunt might communicate with you and you're more likely to listen to your aunt. And that introduced a new thought. And so we're going to pivot just a bit. There's been a lot made of younger people on social media apps and how it affects their self-image, how it affects how they relate to people, it affects how they engage in school, so forth and so on, right? And there have been elected officials, perhaps even agencies, who have tried to step in to create some measures and metrics so that we can track how social media affects younger people and limit the negative implications of social media on younger people's lives, right? This is more of an opinion, and you're in a better position to have an opinion on this than most folks. How much involvement do you think that the government should have in a decision like that? And do children, because we talked earlier about TikTok. TikTok is, I associate it more with younger people. Do they really pose a national security risk? And should they, I don't know. My question's in there somewhere, but I kind of want to get your thoughts on this, essentially. So what should the government be stepping in and saying, oh, you have to be 14 or older to have an Instagram account, that sort of thing? And what risks do you think, at least on a national stage, do children pose to this country?
Yeah, I think that it is long been a responsibility of our governments to protect our children. They do it a number of different ways, and to give additional restrictions to protect the innocence and inability for children to make a well-informed decision about certain environments or engagements that they are in. That's why there's child protective services. That's why there's all of these things.
Okay, yeah, that's fair.
How it happens, I don't know if they're best suited to do that. And I think much of what you've seen is a holding to account of tech companies and requiring of them to create the tools necessary to equip parents to be able to implement an additional layer of protection, but also to think critically about what they are serving up to children. So I think the most recent company that made an announcement was Instagram, about how they've got like teen profiles and children's profiles that kind of limit the types of things that come to kids. And I think that's an important advent that, driven by this tech company, is hopefully informed by the stats and information they're seeing about how children are being manipulated, targeted, all of these things. And those are very real things. I worked at Google as well. And, all of the data that developers and users can get to be able to target different demographics and send information to them is a very real thing. And it's one thing for an adult to be able to discern content. It's another thing for a kid to be flooded with them. And what we're seeing is things like their self-esteem is being impacted, and they're comparing themselves to these like manipulated images of women and grown-ups and thinking that their bodies need to look a certain way. So I think holding organizations to account for that and then creating the tools for parents to go the rest of the way is important. That vis-a-vis TikTok and the national security ban, I mean, getting all this information about the people who will one day lead our country, China is hard, a lot of information. When quantum computers hit AI and they are able to crunch all of that data and use it to whatever end, whatever their desired end is.
Yeah, that's fair. Okay.
Information will be important. It might not be important today. But even that, I would venture to say, is not true, because if I can gain access to your child's iPad, get on your Wi-Fi, I can get on your computer, and then I can get whatever I was trying to get. So I wouldn't create as much distance between a child's use and a malicious action. But it could just be harvested for later. So there's a range there. And you'd be surprised how many not children are using TikTok. I mean, I don't use TikTok, but companies are using TikTok, brands are using TikTok.
Yeah.
And
we use TikTok, so, that's
there
fair.
You go.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we use it for now.
It's very interesting having this conversation with you, because bad actors tend to be callous with regards to who they harm to reach their end. So using children as Trojan horse was something that I didn't even consider. That once you said it, it seemed so incredibly obvious. You're going to start to notice a bit of a theme with our questions, because in a time of hyper partisanship, things like national cybersecurity should be straightforward, something that affects and impacts all of us in a way that you think we would really come together,
not be politicized
on this one, right? You've had the benefit of working in both private and public sectors. Is there incentive for the private and public sector to come together to combat challenges in the cybersecurity space? And if, again, you're advising the next president to try to strengthen these partnerships, what are some strategies, or do you think there is a such thing as an effective strategy to get everyone involved even, our tech companies, with making sure that our country is protected from outside threats with regards to our national security?
Yeah, I mean, public-private partnerships or public-private collaboration is essential. The government has one set of data and a view. They've got intelligence sources. They've got all of those things. But private companies, especially tech companies, are on the front lines of use. And so they get a different viewpoint. And when all of those things come together, along with civil society that gets to do a lot of big thinking about what the future could look like, all of that, we have better policy that is actionable and informed by the technology and doesn't create as many unintended consequences. The shift that was made in the creation of the office that I was talking about was really centering public-private partnerships, public-private collaboration as part of the policymaking process. And you see that across the federal government. That work must continue. To your point about cybersecurity not being a partisan issue or shouldn't be a partisan issue, traditionally it hasn't been. Traditionally, cybersecurity is a space where whether you are talking to a Republican administration or a Democratic administration, you will see similar prioritization. Now, the stack rank might move and shift based on the environment or based on resources and based on their priorities. But overarchingly, the direction we need to move in, the work that needs to be done will be the same. We saw after the 2016 election and moving into a Trump presidency was a desire to just rip out things that President Obama had done and had his name on it, even things in the space of cybersecurity and technology that traditionally had a lot of bipartisan support or were nonpartisan issues. And so what we're on the cusp of is another situation like that, where an issue that traditionally and continually tends to be pretty nonpartisan and have a lot of support, although, like I said, things might be prioritized different based on administrations, could be politicized, and different aspects of it have become politicized in a more long-standing perspective, like the election context, right? Securing election infrastructure should not be a political or partisan issue. We should all want that. We want people to vote. We want people to get out and be able to exercise their civic duty. But there have been claims of manipulating speech and content moderation and other things waged against agencies and entities and governments that are trying to promote that kind of resilience in election narratives and election infrastructure. That's really problematic because really at the base of it, it should just be that we are trying to let people vote and trying to let people get the information they need to do that effectively. So the next administration must prioritize a focus on cybersecurity, must prioritize the continued work on election integrity and resilience and securing our elections and combating nation states that are trying to confuse and sow distrust amongst the narratives around our election. That work must continue. How that will continue will really depend on which administration wins. VP Harris has made very clear in the work that she has done as VP and then in her policy platforms that will be a focus and that work will continue. I was at her 2020 campaign speech and she talked about cybersecurity even then. That has long been an issue for her. And that's something that as a nation that is on the forefront of innovation is a hallmark of who we are. That should be a priority. And so that's what we need from the future, from the next administration.
Okay. I like that. And I know that we've had you for a good amount of time, so we won't linger, but we're here now. And I want to ask you, you mentioned the next administration, which we're going to find that out in the coming days. But the truth of the matter is that Vice President Harris and the former president, neither of them know. I mean, most people in general don't know as much as you do about cybersecurity, about technologies and, just people's digital profiles and how vulnerable we are and what we can do to offset some of those vulnerabilities. You are the expert. You mentioned whether or not one candidate gets in into office or the other one. That will determine kind of the strategy of this country moving forward, right? So I'm going to hit you with a hypothetical, since we've established that neither of them know as much as you. Let's pretend that you are the person who gets to decide. Let's say a genie comes out of a bottle and grants you 3 wishes or whatever, a wish, whatever it is. Talk to us about the version of our national security, of our cyber profile, our digital profile as a country. Talk to us about what the things you would like to see, like a best case scenario, a wish list of secure, positive, accurate information, and again, profiles for us. What does that look like for you, in your opinion, for the rest of the country, if you got to choose?
Yeah. So first, let me just say something about we are about to find out the candidate.
Mhm.
If we do not find out who the person is on election day, please do not be worried. It might take a few days to count ballots, to make sure that we have an accurate count. This election is frighteningly close. And so I just want to take this moment to remind people that if on November 5th, we do not immediately know who the person is, that is not a sign of trouble. That is not a sign of election interference. People got to count the votes. We got to figure out what's going on. So first, I just want to take that moment to say that. Now, for a next administration, the things that I think that they should prioritize to protect you as individuals, to set an affirmative vision on technology, to keep us as a leader on innovation, we need to lean in on AI. We did some great work while I was there on the AIEO, and there was just a national security memorandum talking about national security uses, but we need to figure out the regulatory landscape. So a next administration would continue that work, continue to invest in people being trained, not only to work in the federal government, but to work in the private sector on AI, cybersecurity, and other technical fields. There's so much money, resources, and economic opportunity there. Plus, if communities that are traditionally not represented are in them, we are more secure because we have a better understanding of use. We would be at the forefront of enabling AI innovation and regulation and thinking about what that looks like. We would continue to invest in our cybersecurity of our critical infrastructure. I want to make sure your hospital can service you. I want to make sure your kid's school is not taken down by a ransomware attack. I want to make sure that your bank is resilient. And so that investment in making sure that our critical infrastructure is secure is important. And then also securing all of these clean energy transition initiatives that we have. It's really important to make sure that the energy grid that we set up to support electric vehicles is secure, and that we're thinking about that interplay. So as we make a transition to a next administration, I mean, there are a lot of things to prioritize, but those would be at the top of my hit list to get started.
So, you know this, Ramses and I know this. Our work does not stop November 5th. That is not the finish line. That might even be a jump off point. That might be where we need to really start getting to work. Post election, what's next for you? And to our listeners who want to learn more, be more involved, support you, how do they keep up with you? How do we keep up with you? Websites, social media, please.
Yeah. I mean, you can follow me at CamilleStewartGloster.com or at Camille ESQ on Instagram or X, but I don't really use that much anymore.
We feel you, trust me.
Yes. So, but you can find me, Google me. But for me, one of my priorities right now is we're doing a lot of work on global governance of artificial intelligence. And I want to make sure that that global governance actually includes the global majority, countries in Africa, the Caribbean, Latin America. I hosted an event with 40 world leaders last week on that very topic to make sure a summit that's happening in France to advance global governance included more of those countries. My work will be focused on all of the things that I outlined for an administration to doing from my perch outside of through my company, and making sure that the work continues and holding our leaders to account, whether they're leaders in the private sector or the public sector. So yes, please follow me. I will be putting out information, translating these issues for folks to make sure that you understand how people are working on your behalf and can hold them accountable.
Well, I will tell you this, you've definitely translated a lot for me. I think I'm reasonably, what's the word? Reasonably technologically sophisticated. I'm not a hacker or anything like that, but I get a new iPhone, I can, set it up by myself. I don't need a
iPhone master.
Yeah, you know what I'm saying? Like, and all the, obviously I work in studios and all this, new software update, all this sort of stuff, reasonably, sophisticated. But, as far as a translator goes, there's levels. I'm reminded in conversations like these, because it's very easy for us to be vulnerable. I don't really have anything I think any hackers would be interested in, but when you lay it out like that, I beg
to differ.
Well, I was just gonna say they are very. Most of these criminals are criminals of opportunity. Just like if you drop your wallet and somebody grabs it and they're like, "Shoot, I got some cash." It's the digital equivalent. They're gonna try to get whatever you got, whether it's $5 or $1,500.
Oh well, shoot.
And
they need $5 that bad. It's all good. Come on, get it.
I mean, they will take it, and that's
I'm being funny. In any event, I do appreciate you taking the time to share this with us. To, as you mentioned, translate this not just to us but to our listeners. But I also appreciate you being the voice in the room. I don't, let me speak for you, but I'm going to speak for you. I would assume that in a lot of these rooms, you're the only voice that looks like you. You're the only person who has the perspective of a Black woman. You can bring perspective into spaces that would just as easily overlook you. Now, I'm not saying these are bad people, but it's just hard to consider everyone's perspective if people are trying to do whatever. And so being present, that really matters. And I want to say this before we let you go. I know that it's not simply just you being present. I know that there was a whole lifetime of work that it took, of perhaps you often being the only person in the room, to get to the point where you're like affecting change on a national level. And yet, and still, you mentioned going to France and, making sure that the global majority was represented. You might be on CNN after this show. You might be on ABC News, but this is the show where we can salute that part of your story and highlight how significant that is. To us, that matters. To our listeners, that matters. And so thank you would be insufficient in this moment. We have to actually acknowledge that. You are protecting us in ways that maybe maybe you don't, but it's up to us to be able to say that. And so I'm accused. We had this conversation already, so we feel this way collectively.
Yes, ma'am.
So we wanted to take a moment to say thank you for doing what you're doing for us. Thank you for your resiliency on the journey that I'm confident that you had to get there. Now, where you are, you can bring us into the room with you. You can bring, Q mentions his daughter quite a bit on this show, and how there are heroes like you that exist. And, this path that we're on, we get to not only learn about heroes like you, but we get to actually have conversations and learn from heroes like you. And that matters. And we are the ones who have to, and honestly get to. It's an honor to get to be able to acknowledge that. So again, thank you isn't enough, but unfortunately, I'll run out of words eventually. So I will surmise the rest of what I could say, or what we could say, by saying thank you for all that you've done and all that you're doing. That really matters to us.
I really appreciate that. I'm humbled by the acknowledgement and grateful to have the opportunity to show up for our daughters and our sons and all of you in these rooms, because you're right. I am often the only, but it is my honor and my pleasure to show up and make sure your voices are heard.
We'll take it.